Welcome to Live Courageously, podcast show number 16 of 2022. I chose the title of Live Courageously because that has been the conscious theme of my life for the last 2 years since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And it's been an unconscious theme of most of my life. And if you haven't seen the previous 15 podcasts that I've done with some of my amazing friends sharing their powerful stories of overcoming all odds and going on to live their best lives, you can watch them on my John Duffy YouTube channel. So I recommend you check them out. And if you got nothing else to do, binge watch them. It's better than Netflix, trust me. And you'll get a free dose of inspiration and courage and meet some amazing, courageous friends of mine. So interestingly, since I started this podcast show, I keep meeting and becoming friends with some even more courageous people to have on the show in the future. So stay tuned to meet some of the great people in my life every week. I'm going to attempt to do 2 shows every Sunday. And I may have to pause a little bit as I'm heading out to do a feature film pretty soon for about 8 weeks. So we'll see how that one goes. I'll keep you posted. But what this show is about faith over fear. I believe fear is just a reaction, but courage is a choice. And I suggest you need to consciously choose courage to get through life and to deal with what life may throw at you in the future. I recently came from a real short business trip, got off the plane today, and I spent 2 hours on the plane. My person who sat next to me in the seat was in the Marine Corps and is in the Marine Corps for 20 years. And we had a long conversation about his life, his activity, and once again, talking about courageous people that I keep meeting. He's somebody who also exemplifies courage. So it was a great conversation on the plane before I came here to do the show. There's many types of courage, and today my guest embodies many different types of courage, as you're going to see as we begin the conversation with him. So today I encourage everybody who's watching this to adopt the spirit of courage in the face of any and all fears. So let me introduce you today to my guest and friend, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Reynolds, or Edward Ed Reynolds Jr. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds is U.S. Air Force retired and has a long and varied career. For 22 years, his service included being a navigator on an air refueling and refueling tankers, a missiles targeting officer for MIRVs, which are multiple independently targetable reentry vehicle. Also an intelligence advisor to the Vietnam Air Force and an action officer for 6 years in the Pentagon. There, Ed introduced computer terminals to the air staff and managed the United States Air Force aircraft inventory database. Ed is over 5,000 flying hours, which is just mind-boggling to me, including over 640 combat hours in 147 combat missions. Just kind of want to take a pause on that. I mean, that's just there alone, the courage of all that. And that just is just part of his life. Following his service in the Air Force, he worked as an international IT management consultant at United Airlines, at SRI International, and for several other defense contractors. Ed formed service management consulting groups for companies before focusing on traveling the world. Now it gets even more wild. Ed is one of only 110 people. Take that in. Is billions of people on this planet. Only 110 people who have known to have visited every country in the world. Ed completed visiting all of the 193 United Nations countries in the year 2014. One of the top 50 most traveled people in the world and on the list that records world travel. Ed currently leads a Monday morning meeting for a group, Wings Over Wendy's, that we're going to talk about, where over 300 veterans meet weekly and have for many, many years at originally at the Wendy's restaurant in West Hills, and now they've moved to a public school in the Valley as well. We'll talk about that. Ed is also an author and wrote and self-published 2 books in 2021, one entitled Do Not Travel There, Tourist Travel in the Department of State Level 4 Countries. And you probably ain't gonna understand what that is, but he will explain that to all of us. And the second book that Ed wrote was The Making of Mr. Woodstock, a memoir of the artist and poet Robert DePue Reynolds, Ed's brother. So I'd like to welcome today my friend and Lieutenant Colonel Ed Reynolds. Welcome,
Thank
Ed.
you. Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Now I don't have anything left to say. Uh, I I
Hey,
could just start though by
well, you can
saying,
start. You can start all over and hit the other, every country in the world next week.
right. Well, we don't have enough time this afternoon, but the first thing I want to comment on is I I think I'm unique in this. I've never experienced fear. I don't, and I have a hard time relating to other people that are fearful of things. You can't really be uh, fly in some of the planes that I flew in if you had fear, because you never knew when you went out there whether you're going to get back safely, and and you couldn't bebop around Vietnam the way I did as the intelligence advisor to the VNAF, where I had to visit every uh, location that the Vietnamese Air Force had, plus all the ones the Air Force had in Thailand, to learn any good practices to recommend to the Vietnamese Air Force. So you can't be fearful of these things. You don't. It's not like, when you go to combat on the ground and you're going into a firefight, because the way I was traveling, it would be a total surprise. We would land and find holes in the plane that weren't there when we took off, and we, you just couldn't be fearful of these types of things, and that carries over into so many other, going to all the countries in the world. Um, there, some of them were very difficult to get into, as I've written in my book. Do not travel there. Oh, I don't know
Yeah,
where.
we're going to get to that in a minute. Hey, Ed, let me
Yeah,
ask you a question with that. So you're saying, and I'd like to take you back to your youth as to as a young person, and then why you joined the Air Force. But that attitude that you did not have fear was something you had as a young man, and then you took that into the military. Why? What was that about you that you were like, and what took you into
I
joining
don't
the Air
know.
Force, doing
Just
all that?
I just I can't define fear, and I just don't. Uh, you know, go to the top of the Empire State Building. People didn't want to lean over. They were fearful, even though that you're safe. But I couldn't relate to that. So even growing up, when people will say, "Oh, I'm afraid of doing this. I'm afraid to get in that boat. I'm afraid to swim out there. There might be a shark or something like that." I said, "What are you talking about? I, I don't know how to define it." So, um,
So
uh,
you obviously did not, and for some people it's about overcoming fear, but in your case, you basically just had an attitude where you were willing to go forward and you didn't feel the fear. You just
right,
basically and so that was a unique characteristic of who you are and were. Um, and that for people who don't know, I mean, when you were flying those planes, and let's go, and I'm gonna jump around and do it a little bit differently this time, but as you were flying those planes in Vietnam and on all those missions, we're not talking about the technology we have today. This is the technology we had back then, which was different too. So it was, I mean, for you to go on all those missions, there was danger, there was risk, whether you felt it or not, it was clearly there. And yet, you were courageous and you were somebody who went into it with that attitude because it was what you did. It was who you were as a pilot and a thing. Explain a little bit of that to the audience, because a lot of what I want people to do is when you meet people, I meet people like you who I think are a role model of being courageous and being adventurous. I want to learn from that because I think that's how we learn to do those kind of things in our life. So tell us a little bit about that in your pilot in era in
well,
Vietnam. That
yeah.
was
So I wasn't actually the pilot. I was the navigator,
right.
telling the pilot telling the pilots where to go.
Right.
So I told them the wrong direction, that it's on me if we get shot at. But the point is that I just uh, volunteered and went out of my way. When I got assigned to Vietnam, I had um, a top secret ESI, expanded background check, clearance from my missile targeting days at SAC headquarters, and they said, well, first of all, I wasn't supposed to go to Vietnam because of the clearance. I was supposed to just get my ticket punched over in Thailand, and I begged a colonel that I knew in Saigon to get transferred to Vietnam. And then it was at the very last minute that they had this vacancy to work with the Vietnamese. And then I said, oh, I said, yeah, okay, that'll be interesting. And uh, and then when I started finding out about it, I went to the general and said, you know, I've got this clearance and I'm not supposed to be traveling around uh, in the country, but I can't really do my work without traveling around there. And he says, yeah, technically, I'm not supposed to allow you to do that with that clearance, but uh, if you're not afraid, I'm not afraid, and and go and do that. You know, uh, you can go get a cyanide pill issued at the pharmacy, but I didn't do that. You know, if you get captured, you're not supposed to speak uh, about all those secrets. But I'm dyslexic, and uh, I um, I wouldn't have been able to spill a lot of beans anyway because I couldn't explain the names of the Russian cities or the Chinese cities that we were targeting. So if they were trying to say what's the U.S. plan to bomb our country, I'd say, well, yeah, I know Moscow. Well, everybody knows that we're going to bomb Moscow. I can pronounce that, but all those other countries, I still can't pronounce them. Even when I travel to them in my world travels, you know, like I took the train um, across Russia, and we kept getting off at all these places that I, in retrospect, targeted years ago. But I still can't pronounce the names.
Well, here's the thing too. You know, I met somebody this weekend who, for those who don't know, and I didn't know, but what you just talked about, Ed, about that you weren't supposed to be there because of your security clearance, and he told me he was the same. In his case, he wasn't shipped over to the war zone because of that. And he said the reason, which was news to me, was because you had too much valuable information, or at least they believe you did. So if you were captured, that was why they didn't want you in that thing. That's correct, right? But
Right.
you
Yeah.
talked your way into it, and you ended up there. And what does that mean? You were trained in the Vietnamese Air Force. In what capacity, and what did you do with them?
Well, uh, I was the interface between the Vietnamese and the U.S. So our group was actually stationed out of uh, Washington D.C. So we weren't reporting to anybody in uh, outside of our own little group, which was led by a two-star general, but we weren't part of Seventh Air Force or PACAF or MACV or any of that Army and Air Force structure in Vietnam. We were we were supposed to be the advisors to the Vietnamese, and that really meant um, the interface to represent them with the U.S. forces and to get things for them because it was during the Nixon drawdown, and I really believed in that of turning the war over to them. So I
What
was
year,
doing.
what year? What years was that in?
It was 72.
72. Okay. Uh-huh.
So I was turning. I was doing everything to make them self-sufficient. Now the irony of it is that the colonel that I was advising, he outranked me, and he had been not only attended all the U.S. intelligence schools in the Army and the Air Force, but he also spent a year in Colorado teaching at the Air Force intelligence school. So he
Wow.
knew intelligence from top to bottom. He'd lived at it his whole life. So how am I going to advise him on being into? So he said, "Don't worry about it, Ed. I'll take care of you." You know, and he, still a great friend. Um, on my 80th birthday, I was in Washington D.C. and had dinner with him. He's still alive um, in Washington. Spent 25 years with EDS, uh, and a great individual. But uh, going back to the original theme, it's just that I didn't I didn't show fear and I didn't use that as a cop out to say, oh no, I can't go on that mission. And I'd actually go the opposite. I volunteered to fly with the Vietnamese themselves. I flew into Cambodia. We weren't supposed to be in Cambodia, but I'm not with a U.S. plane. I'm with the Vietnamese crew uh, as to be able to report back. This is what the Vietnamese do on their missions, and I flew on their missions to adequately determine whether there were improvements that they could make that I could help them make those improvements.
How rare was that for an American like you to do something like that? How rare?
Well, I mean, um, the advisory group actually been around since the beginning. They were the first people to go over there. Were advisors back in the early '60s, but a lot of them were by the time I got there were just paper pushers, and they didn't volunteer to go out in the field unless they absolutely had to, or to fly with the Vietnamese unless they absolutely had to. There was a few of us that had no fear and lived courageously, and the Vietnamese really appreciated that because we really did get involved with them and felt their pain and I often went to uh, Vietnamese functions. I'd be the only Caucasian there,
Wow.
and fortunately, most of their intelligence officers had been trained in the U.S., so they all spoke English, So I wasn't. Uh, I did carry around a lot of the time a sergeant who had been trained in the Vietnamese language, and I didn't tell them that he understood Vietnamese. So they'd give me these briefings, and then he'd tell me what they were saying backstage, you know, that so I knew who was BSing me and who wasn't in my reports, you know. But,
And you flew 147 combat missions. What over what period of time? And give us some perspective on that too.
yeah,
I mean, that's a lot. That seems like a lot of missions to me as a civilian.
well, a lot of those started in the air refueling business. When I first went over in the '60s, I was temporarily based in Okinawa, and I would fly on the missions that refueled the B-52s that were flying out of Guam. So, um, and then uh, I would pick missions specifically to travel. I've had this bug of traveling all the time. And so I had the choice. I could go on a mission that went out there, refueled, and came back in to Okinawa, or one one flight every day uh, would go on to the Philippines and stay there until the B-52s were coming back, and just in case they needed to be refueled on their return to Guam. So sometimes I take that mission, and the other times I take the mission where the guys would go on to Thailand after refueling the B-52s. And so I spent, and so as soon as you get over the Vietnamese area, then it becomes combat hours. And then all the hours in Vietnam that I flew all over the place were considered combat hours. And like I mentioned earlier, you get shot at, and you'd see the fire coming up from the ground. And I just was, knock on wood, lucky enough that it didn't hit us and shoot us down. Uh, so that's so it's not the same kind of uh, combat hours that say the F4 guys that were striking North Vietnam, where they knew they were going to be uh, SAMs shot at them and everything, and they'd just be lucky that they got back alive. It wasn't that kind of an missions. We were transport planes. I flew and helicopters uh, doing hops in between the different bases, and that was all considered combat time because you could get shot at. I got wounded in one mission over there, uh, but they didn't give me a Purple Heart because I was the wound was because my plane was exiting um, our orbiting point, and our relief plane that was supposed to pick up the orbit came in at the wrong altitude, and we almost had a midair collision, and our plane dropped down, and I was the staff officer, so I went in the seat, and I went up into the ceiling and gashed my head open, and, and it was over enemy territory. And the doctor that treated me says you're eligible for the Purple Heart, but when we put in the paperwork, they said no. Aircraft accidents, if you're hurt inside the plane without it being a bullet, um, so that's the same as if a fighter pilot was trying to dodge a SAM and hit his helmet on the side of the uh, cockpit and injured himself. They don't give him a Purple Heart for that unless a piece of the SAM explosion came in.
Got
So
it.
yeah,
So after that, you come back and you mentioned, and we'll talk about too when we talk about your writing as being dyslexic, but you come back out of Vietnam and you're working in the Pentagon, and you introduce computer terminals to the air staff there, which
yeah,
nowadays is like for a lot of us and people who are in this area, you're like, really? I mean,
yeah.
they didn't have computer terminals.
Right. When I
So
went into the Air Force in 1950s, there weren't any operational computers in the Air Force. About the first year that I got in, they came up with um, the first computer terminals for air defense, um, and they built these big uh, radomes all over the coast, which are still of them still are there today in a lot of places like out Cape Cod and stuff. And then they came in about the second year I was in the Air Force. They got a small IBM computer. Well, no, they weren't small, but they got an IBM computer to come in and do the supply logistics support. So it wasn't until the middle of the '60s that I I even knew saw a computer. It was always in the back office. But when I got to SAC headquarters, I had to get trained on computers uh, because the MERV missile um, can't be targeted by just drawing a string on a map because if they were carrying 3 warheads. So if you wanted to go to Crimea, as an example, you had to drop the first 2 warheads off in St. Petersburg in order to get the range for the third one to go all the way down to the Black Sea. So that was a big computer problem that I started working with TRW on, um, and and we were using a CRT, and everybody else was using key punch. And when I got to the Pentagon, they ran what they call budget exercises, and the action officers had to fill out creation sheets, and I had a young lady that sat in a vault, and she'd get that and she'd type it in, uh, and it would go down to the computer, and it would take. Then the next day, I had to deliver the printouts to the guys, and they'd say, "Oh, hey, she marked that up wrong." You know, it took 3 days to do one exercise. So I went to the general and I said, they've got this thing called CRTs where they don't have to fill out forms. You can just fill it out on the screen, and then it goes down there right away. And you could cut 3 days down to one. And how much is it going to cost? And I told him, and he says, do it, Reynolds, do it. So I got the air staff to put these things in, and then the budget guy said, "Hey, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do it over in budget." And so then uh, we rolled it out in the budget. Now, 5 years later, the PCs. We're talking late '70s. So when I got out in '79 and went to work for United Airlines, it was in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and they were just coming up with the Apple computer. And I actually sold part time. I was a part time salesman for the Apple II computer at the time, because I was convinced that I wrote a paper in 1969 that predicted that every home would have CRTs like their TV set, and that they'd be able they could sit in a home and access the library, every book in the world. And the professor gave me an F for the idea. He thought that was too wild an idea that would never happen. And now,
was that the same professor that said FedEx was never going to happen too?
Right. And they got it. But he's also the same guy that was an active duty colonel, teaching night school, and they sent him to Thule. He wasn't the brightest guy in the group.
But you saw some of that, obviously bringing CRT into the Pentagon, seeing that with Apple, seeing that the computers were going to be, in everyone's house. I mean, you had that advanced vision of that because of what you did, and then you worked in, coming out of the military with all these defense contractors, United Airlines, SRI. So you were working on a pretty
I should be wealthier, because I got in on the ground floor. I had all these ideas, but I never, as an example, I wrote a spreadsheet when I was in the Pentagon, like Excel. I never thought of commercializing it,
right?
But I used it for our own office work. I'm where the term help desk. I implemented the first commercial help desk that was based on PCs. When they had a rudimentary one on the mainframe, but that was a dumb terminal. You call the guy up, and he couldn't pull your record up right away and see the details. And so the whole help desk industry that went on into India and the Philippines and South America and everything, I got in on the ground floor of that. I didn't make any money off of it, but
well, you were still ahead of your time with all of that, which is pretty amazing. Some of the stuff, your experiences, and I we'll talk later. I know when I met you for the first time and heard some of them, I was just pretty blown away and impressed by all the amount of things that you've done in your life. And you mentioned earlier, and obviously the whole thing about not living with fear and living courageously kind of feeds into the next thing because, being one of 110 people that have visited every country in the world, obviously people who are not courageous don't do that. They don't go on those kind of ventures. And you didn't go to just safe countries. You went to countries that probably was not a good idea or was not recommended to go, but you weren't afraid anyway because you've already told us that. But you always had a love of traveling, and you did it in the military. But you also, besides traveling in the military, you took it on after you left the military as well. Tell us about your journey, and then we'll talk about eventually the book that you wrote about a piece of that journey.
Yeah.
But it's a journey that took you to more countries. For those who don't know, and I didn't know until you told me, Ed, there's 193 UN countries, but there's some additional countries too. So you've traveled to every country in the world. So take us a little bit on that journey that you went on.
Yeah, well, I've always wanted to travel, and that's why I joined the Air Force rather than the Army or the Navy. I just thought that it would be more efficient to travel in the Air Force than going to sea, even though Navy gets around a lot. But and so my wife was not a big fan of cruising, and we finally got her to agree to a cruise in '99, and uh, and then I took up cruising, and in two and I had a house that my mother had left me that I was having a lot of trouble renting, and just before the big uh, right at the height of the boom around 2006 7, I sold the house, and I told my wife, I'm going to take the profit off of this house and use it for travel. We were on a cruise, my first cruise to South Africa, and I'm going down the west coast of Africa, and I'm standing in front of a map, and the guy standing next to me, and my mother had lived in Iran for a while on a government contract. And I was saying, boy, I'd sure like to get to Iran someday. And he says, I just came back from there. And he says, the group that took me there is having a cocktail party tonight. And why don't you come? So he gave me the cabin. I found out here's a group of people that wanted to go to every country in the world. And they've been ticking them off. So I joined that group, and that gave me the mechanism to go. But they were cautious, and they wouldn't schedule me to places that were dangerous. And that's where we get the name of the book is that the state.
Before you go to that, what the name of the company that you travel with? What was their name?
It was called Advantage Travel and Tours out of San Diego, Poway actually. And
so you went on a lot of travel with them, but
right.
Then, like you're about to say, so take us further. You're about to
but they didn't want to take the risk or the liability of sending me to some of the risky places. I did go with them to North Korea. That's a whole chapter in the book. That was fascinating.
Well, you're going to have to tell us a little bit about that in a minute, but not the whole chapter, but a little bit. But keep going where you're going with.
Right. But there's an organization called the Travelers Century Club that was founded in Santa Monica, and the chairman at the time, it was German, and he had contacts all over the world. So there were the State Department gives you 4 levels of caution when you get a visa, and level 4 is do not travel there. And if you go to the State Department map, they have these color codes, and they have red for countries that they say don't travel there. That's why the name of the book. So Klaus was able to get me into like Libya. I've got a lot of friends in that Advantage Travel Group that have been to 192 countries, but they've never been to Libya because you can't get a visa to Libya. He was able to get me a work visa. So I went in there theoretically as a worker. Now,
What year?
this was in 2006 or something.
2006 and something. Okay.
13. No, it's a little later than that.
Later than that?
Yeah. And the same thing. He got me into Yemen and Mogadishu in 2013, and those were places that Advantage Travel wouldn't schedule me in. And you go in as on a work visa with a hope, and then you go to those great ruins, and the tour guides there, they haven't had a tourist since Gaddafi was killed, and they just rolled out the red carpet and gave me private tours through all those old Roman places because they're still trying to do business with locals, and that was fascinating. But on the way to the airport to leave there'd been the night before there was a lot of gunfire, and the guide, and we were going by cars burned out. He says, "Oh, they only killed 32 people last night in the in the firefights in Libya."
Now, of those level 4 countries, and you speak about them in the book, obviously North Korea, Libya, Yemen. What other countries are level 4 that you write about in the book?
Well, yeah, and it goes up and down. There's more on the list now than there was back then. But
when you were traveling, there was a little less of them.
Gotcha. Yeah, South Sudan, of course, Iraq. We were the first American tourists to go into Iraq after the Iraqi War.
Wow.
Syria, Jordan, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Mali, got caught in a war in Mali, and Cuba, which is difficult to get into, and North Korea. So I had kept a journal, and so people kept asking me questions about those countries, and finally one person says, "Why don't you put a book together on that?" And so I went in to all my journals. So that first book was pretty easy to do, is just taking those journals and editing them and formatting them into a book.
And that book, Do Not Travel There, is on Amazon. So anybody who would like to read about Ed's adventures in those level 4 countries can read the book and get the book on Amazon. Do Not Travel There. So yeah. So Ed, of all those countries, like you said, there was obviously danger in all of them of different types. Each place was a little different, each depending on the time, I would imagine. What was maybe some of the more surprising things that you experienced in those countries, that be given somebody with your wealth of travel, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, Yemen was one of the most fascinating. I mean, I don't know how much you know about Yemen, but there are these apartment buildings that date back to the 13, 14, 15 centuries, built on the side of mountains there, and that sort of thing. And then they've got Scotia Island, and I went out to the island there and ran into a couple of young ladies from Stanford University sweatshirts and said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, we work for the State Department in Washington, D.C. This is the safest place for women to travel in the world. Nobody knows about it. Beautiful beaches. And they just roll out the carpet for tourists. And there's not that many of us. And so that was a big surprise.
Yeah.
And very safe. But the mainland It's got all these fighting. I'm in a having lunch one day with a tour guide, and this pickup truck drives in, and we're sitting on a balcony on the second floor overlooking the parking lot, and the guys have a gun rack in this pickup truck, and they take the guns out of the rack and walk into the restaurant, and they sit down and put them on their lap,
Huh.
pointing at me. And
Wow.
I told my tour guide, I said, I got to go to the bathroom. I left. He must have said something to him. When I came back, they were up against the wall next to him. But that was, and the thing there, it's surprising in Yemen. There's this um, narcotic that is very prominent in that region of the world called cat, KAT, and beautiful, overlooking the city type of place that you would take your date when you're in high school to park at night. You go up there and it's all men up there chewing this cat or
Huh.
smoking this cat. They're all higher than a kite.
Wow.
You're taking your life in your hands to just drive up there after at sunset. Uh, and that's a big surprise. Mali, I'm sitting there in the airport and I'm reading it on my cell phone, the New York Times. The U.S. isn't going to get involved in this, and I'm saying, looking out the window, and I say, yeah, that's a an Air Force C-17 from and has the state of Washington on the tail. What do you mean we're not being involved in this stuff? And the U.S. for NATO was supplying the NATO guys with supplies. A lot of craziness in traveling in some of these countries. The South Sudan. Had just broken off from Sudan and just overrun by NGOs and contractors and stuff like that. It's just nuts. But they wouldn't let us take pictures.
Wow.
We're and I was in charge of the group at that particular thing, and and they wanted to arrest one of the women with me that just wanted to take a picture of the terminal when we came out of baggage control, and
Huh.
just thought, hey, here's a picture of the name of the city up there over the terminal, and and it and we go to the restaurant that Teddy Roosevelt and his son went to after Roosevelt was president when he was touring Africa, and it was in it, and he'd spent a night to this place, and she wanted to take some pictures in there, and they they about threw us in jail. What the hell for? We didn't. It's just a lot of little crazy stuff like that.
Well, it obviously you've lived a life that doesn't get covered in an hour, but I'm gonna try and take us through the rest of some of the things you've done for the last 15 minutes we got. The other, besides writing this book, which is called "Do Not Travel" on Amazon, about going to those particular level 4 countries. Um, you also wrote a second book that's also on Amazon, "The Making of Mr. Woodstock," and it's a pretty wild memoir of a wild time, the 60s. So tell us a little bit about that
Yeah,
and what that was like and what that story's about. And once again, people can get that on Amazon because it's if you want to take a visit to the 60s,
yeah,
this will take you back. Go ahead. Tell us
yeah,
about
yeah. So I had this crazy brother who was a disciple of Jack Kerouac's. He wanted to live the life on the road, and he uh, was very successful in high school, in growing up through high school, president of his class all the time, and won awards for his writing and uh, his artwork, and went to Colgate, and all of a sudden wasn't the big man on the campus, and could not quite handle that, and got kicked out of Colgate and joined the Marines, and why the Marines, and finding out that that uh, all his fellow Marines hadn't even gone to college. Most of them hadn't even graduated from high school, and and so he had a rough time in the Marines. When he came back out, he tried to go back to Colgate and went one semester, and 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 uh, couldn't hack it for some reason that I never got clear. But then he was working in New York City and was was getting quite a successful career in advertising in New York City at Madison, and got married, had a child, and then all of a sudden, coming up on my wedding, he disappears. And when we discover him again, he's down in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, um, living a life of by just being a sketch artist. And uh, and so when we discovered that and went down there to try to talk him into coming back, uh, he disappeared from there and went to Spain. And we didn't know that. We didn't know where he was. And uh, I found out from a cartoon artist from Playboy magazine that had his finger on the underground, that he was running a bar in Terramolina, Spain. We contacted him, and he wrote back 6 months later a roll of toilet paper. I could actually get it out for you. Ballpoint pen. It was about that thick,
Huh.
um, folded up. And the long story is that he got accused of being a drug kingpin, but but the police, the local police, testified in his behalf that he wasn't a seller; he was just a user. So the judge said, "I'm going to stamp your passport persona non grata. Now get the hell out of the country." And so we brought him back from Spain, uh, and he tried to go straight for about 3 or 4 months, and fell off again, and ended up in San Francisco the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And he ended up living on a houseboat there, meeting a young lady, and getting married. And then a year later, after the first child, he heard about Woodstock needing people to work for uh, the concessions there, and uh, he got over to Woodstock and worked the concessions, and then stayed with that hippie group for a couple of years. When I went to Vietnam, I ran into him in San Francisco, and I said, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "They kicked me out of the commune because I couldn't perform. And you had to service all the girls in the commune." And the doctor said, "If you get off the drugs and if you get off the liquor, you probably get an erection again." And so he joined AA, and he went back to Woodstock for a reunion of the people that had put it on, and just stayed there and became the town character. And when he died, which was as a result of a unfortunate accident, uh, at the funeral they called him Mr. Woodstock. Mr. Woodstock had passed away, and that's the name of the book. Uh, he was in the Woodstock Times 140 times
Wow.
in the 10 years that he was in Woodstock.
Well, here's two books, two Reynolds brothers. A boat went on different journeys of a very different type. Ain't that the case? I mean,
Yeah,
you to every country in the world, him to becoming Mr. Woodstock and traveling his journey in life. And so check out both of those books. I recommend The Making of Mr. Woodstock and Do Not Travel There. And then then Ed, still is doing more stuff. And where I met Ed is right here. There's a thing called a Wings Over Wendy's. Um, and that's the logo, right? And that's established in 2002 at Wendy's restaurant. So tell us about, because
Yeah,
last year
yeah. So Wings Over Wendy's was, has this group that hasn't missed a Monday meeting in 21 years, 20 years, and we. Um, and when I'd come back from these travels, I would talk to them about Iraq and North Korea and stuff like that, which I thought was they'd find interesting. And uh, because of my writing those journals, I started helping them with the newspaper. And then the guy that was publishing the newspaper got ill, and all of a sudden I'm now the publisher of the newspaper. So I've got the newspaper, and I've got and then the guy running the meetings asked me to help out a couple of weeks a month, and and so I would run the meetings and learn how to run the meetings. And then he passed away, and I'm now, as I call myself, the stuckee. It's not a it's not a an elected position. We're not a 501c, surprisingly, because nobody wants to be involved in the paperwork that you'd have to go through, keep minutes and register with the state and all that kind of stuff. So I just so the best title for me is I'm the facilitator. So I make sure that we have a meeting every Monday, and I have a bunch of volunteers that get the coffee and donuts, and get speakers and arrange the speakers. And I got a young man that's helps me out technically running the Zoom hybrid type of it. So it's uh, we meet every Monday morning, and then Tuesday a smaller group meets with another, and it's not as fancy, and I just attend that. And then we have lunch on Thursdays, and of course after the meeting on Mondays we go to Wendy's. So he's happy that we're not meeting there anymore, but we're still giving him the business.
That's good. Hey, now
So
I think we met at Wendy's. I believe. I think I was brought along by a dear friend, Bob Donovan,
yeah,
and I think that's how I met you, Ed. And then you invited me to speak a couple of times, and I had a chance to speak with the group, which I was honored to do. What is the group composed of? You said 20 years of meeting every week. It's not even an
yeah,
official nonprofit. Who comes
yeah.
and
So it started as aviation aficionados, and that's a little bit how they came up with the name of Wings Over Wendy's, because there's a air shows throughout the United States are always wings over, like locally here it's wings over Camarillo,
right?
and so they call themselves Wings Over. And then they weren't all pilots, but they were aviation uh, passengers, interested artists, anything to do with aviation. And then it expanded, and then it became open to uh, it's open to anybody, really. And some of our most ardent supporters are like widows and veterans. And now I say that the theme is to attack loneliness. And
Mm,
so it's the whole idea is you start the week Monday morning, you go to this meeting, and that gives you and it gets you over, it gets you out of bed for the rest of the week. You can sleep in on the weekends, but Monday morning, get up early, go to Wings Over Wendy's, and that sort of sets the schedule for your week. And so now uh, we've got guys that have never been in the military, never even flown on airplanes, uh, attending it regularly. It's a camaraderie, uh, a supportive group, and that's the main thing. Now,
well, some of the things that I was just so impressed by. Obviously, there's so much of the group, but during the COVID period, two things happened. Obviously, you were able to pivot to technology and keep everybody together. A lot of old people in their 80s, 90s, and keep them together every Monday morning on Zoom. And you'd have like 75 people, all these folks, on Zoom, having a Zoom conference when things were shut down. And then as soon as you could, you open back up again and went with a hybrid a version of back in real life, seeing each other, and then some people on Zoom as well. So I was impressed by the way you pivoted to do all that, but then I was also impressed by the courage of these people who came back out and came back as soon as they could to be back face to face with each other and to have that. And that says a lot for the camaraderie of the group and how important the group is to these folks. But you want to speak to those things.
Yeah. I mean, we're now opened up. I've got regulars from all over the United States and occasionally from all over the world. I got two or three that come in from England and that have heard about us uh, and as an example, one of our members, uh, female, World War II type, turned 100 years old yesterday, and they had a big family had a big party for her, and there was probably 20 Wings Over Wendy's people there to support her because she's a regular, sits up front every week. Um, and we just had a gentleman that turned 100 in June that we had a party for. Unfortunately, his daughter just passed away, and we're she would bring him to the meeting, so we got to figure out how to get him to the meetings again. And we've got actors like Jimmy Weldon, that's 99, that comes to the meeting. Um, has been for years. He always gives us the Pledge of Allegiance, and we've got a young high school girl with a beautiful voice, and we recorded her singing the national anthem. And
And if you haven't ever seen Jimmy's dedication to the flag that he does, it's just one of the most amazing things you could ever see.
yeah,
Such a powerful presentation honoring the flag and he's 99 years old, I believe, Jimmy,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yes, Jimmy. And so you can check out Wings Over Wendy's online. Anybody wants to check them out and take a look at what they're doing. And also, like I said, check out Ed Reynolds' books on Amazon. Do Not Travel There and The Making of Mr. Woodstock. Um, and once again, Ed, I mean, I think, we started out with you talking about you being fearless and living courageous. And I just think the reason I wanted you on the show, because ever since I met you, just fascinated by the amount of life you've had, but just the way you've embraced it with humor and with courageousness and adventurousness. I mean, I think you're a role model for people to, and like you said, with this group, you inspire them to come every Monday morning, not be lonely, start their week off, and you inspire them in that way as too at Wings Over Wendy's. So I'm honored to know you and call you a friend. And, I think you're a model for the kind of way people need to live in this world courageously. Um, Anything you would like to close out with or say to the people watching it, Ed, beyond what I just touched on?
yeah. Well, yeah, just don't be fearful of things. Look at the facts. And I was blessed because I was influenced by a lot of external events that I didn't have control over, which we didn't have time to talk about today. Surviving lightning strikes and winning a car in college and still owning it, and things like that were external to that I didn't volunteer for or anything, just happened. And uh, and it's been a pleasure to know you, John. And we didn't even mention the fact that I was born in Greenwich Village, and you know, in the right part of New York and not the Bronx.
Unlike my part, the South Bronx. I hear you.
Right, right. And then I'm a Red Sox fan and not a Yankee fan.
Oh, that's better left unsaid for now.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you inviting me to share some of this. It's hard to talk about everything in an hour
It is.
when you got
It
a
is.
life like
Well,
I have, you know.
especially
And,
the life you lived.
yeah,
It's not two books. It's not 1 hour.
yeah,
It's a lifetime. And
yeah,
and the good thing too for everybody who's watching is Ed's still doing so much, like with Wings Over Wendy's and doing all kinds of other events and supporting people. And so he's still out there active. And uh, if that's not a lesson for you, it's like if you're not active and you're not doing stuff, get out there, start doing stuff. You can, you
yeah.
know.
I got two more books now before you publish your first one, so I
You,
got to write those two.
this is one thing I do. This is wrong because he's put more pressure on me than is right because he got his 2 books done. I'm still working on it. All right, I'm getting there, Ed. I'm getting there.
Well,
But you've given me some good inspiration. And matter of fact, I'm working on getting the first one published, and I may have opened up the door this weekend. So I'll keep you posted, but I'm not sure I can catch up with you. I'll do my best. I'll try.
okay. Well,
Ed,
thank you.
thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for sharing your journey, and thank you for telling people about how they should be fearless and live courageously. And keep doing it. And anything I can do to support you, what you do, I will.
Just send money. You know.
Yeah, and send stuff into the green room, right? Food
Yeah.
and liquor.
Okay.
All right, take care, Ed. Talk to you soon.
Right.
Bye. All right, thank you everybody who's been watching. Candace, Maria, Nick, Crystal, and all the folks who's watched it and will watch it later. Thank you for coming on and checking out the story of Lieutenant Colonel Ed Reynolds Jr. and his amazing journey in the military, in the business world, in writing books about his travel to 192 plus states, countries of the world, and also his work with Wings Over Wendy's. You can check out his books on Amazon, Ed Reynolds Jr. And also you can check out Wings Over Wendy's online. So thank you, everybody. Have a fantastic day. And I'll be back on in 2 hours with my next guest. So join me again. No, 2 hours. Is it 2 hours? 1 hour. Oh my God. 1 hour at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Just enough time for me to catch my breath. Have a great day. Take care and God bless.